Team Sport, the first session in our Transformational Leadership webinar series. So if 2020 taught us anything, it's that change is inevitable, but you all know that. So leading through times of disruption is a critical skill as we move forward. So today's session, along with the rest of our series, will provide you with insight into change leadership and help you gain a practical perspective on what you can do today to continue building your skills and resetting for the future. So we have a great session ahead led by AVAP Vice President, Dr. Shannon Sims. Dr. Sims has over 20 years consulting experience as an organizational psychologist focused on behavior change, from simple process improvement to complex high-profile transformations. She has a lot of war stories from almost all industries, including federal and state government, nonprofit, higher education, and commercial sectors. So her advice and recommendations are rooted in a lot of practical experience. So before I hand it over to Shannon, I just want to point out that if you have a question, feel free to submit at any time during the webinar, and we will be sure to answer them at the end. You're welcome to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or the chat function. Also want to mention that today's session will be interactive, so please have your smart device or website browser tab handy. And then lastly, everyone who registered for this webinar will receive an email with a link to view the webinar on demand, along with the link to register for the rest of our series. So let's get started, Shannon.
Vanessa, thank you so much. I appreciate that introduction, and I'm super excited just to be here with you guys today. I know here in Northeast Ohio, it is almost 80 degrees. It feels like Florida. So I'm hoping that wherever you are today, that you are experiencing some level of spring. So thank you for joining me. As Vanessa mentioned, I do have a number of years experience. If you go to the next slide. And I think that too often in my experience, we think that the responsibility of driving and managing change is somehow somebody else's job, that it's the project manager, or it's the leader, or it's the change management team, or the business process owners, or HR, or fill in the blank. And the reality is, yes, it is their job, but it's also our job. It's every single one of us. And so my goal over today is really for us to talk about and to understand just how change management and organizational change management is a team sport. And there is a difference between change management and change leadership. So we'll talk about that. And then I just want to share some thoughts about practical examples on how you can support organizational change on your future and current projects. And over the next 3 weeks, as Vanessa mentioned, we are really going to focus on change leadership, transformational leadership. And yes, these are two completely different things. But in order to learn more about the difference between change leadership and transformational leadership, you're going to need to join us next week and the following week. So let's just get started. And I want you just to take a pause and to think about yourself. And this is where you pull out the poll EV. And I just want you to, think about and respond to this poll on how you feel when change happens to you in the workplace. Not how you feel, not how you think, not what you do, but how do you feel? And Vanessa, we're seeing there we go. Yeah, we're still seeing your poll EV. Yeah. And we're waiting for it to come up on the device. So as you're thinking about that, I can think about how change makes me feel. Sometimes it's anxiety producing, other times it's super exciting. Sometimes, I feel a real sense of optimism. Other times, depending on whether you're touching my paycheck or you're changing my boss or you're moving my office or changing my parking spot, maybe, it makes me a little bit more annoyed. Everybody has different reactions to change, and it's an intensely personal experience. We try in organizations, I think, to make it remove the emotion, but the reality is all change is emotion based. right? And that is really the premise when we think about how you manage and drive organizational change management, how you lead through change. Organizational change management is really more of a pragmatic, practical, structured approach. Step one, step two, do this, do that. Change leadership really has a deep rooting in, I think, emotional intelligence and being able to help people kind of navigate their own personal change cycles. If you go to the next slide. And if you've been on any of these webinars with us in the past, you know I often start and talk about the J curve, and that every project has a period of disruption. And this period of disruption is because we as people have to work our way through from where we are today to where we are in the future. And that can require us to think differently or to change our behaviors. And there's a valley of disruption that will have an impact on from our current state to our future state, right? So we're operating at a certain level of proficiency right now as an organization, and then we're making a change, and we'll see a dip in our productivity and our performance before we start to see that return on the investment. We start to see a performance improvement. We start to see realize the benefits of the project, and that dip often has a lingering effect. If you can kind of advance the next two, there's some lingering efficiency before we see that tangible benefit, and that dip often comes through three reasons. One is we're not aware. A lot of people resist change or question the need for change, right? So we'll see a dip in productivity or performance because we're questioning if the project's even needed. The second time we'll see that dip, or the second reason we'll see the dip, has to do with, as we start to roll out specifics around what that change is going to look like, we may question the validity of the solution because we're very egocentric. And so you didn't ask me for my opinion, so how do I know it's really going to be effective? And sometimes how you'll hear this dip, it comes out with in terms of, but that's not how we do it, or I've been here 30 years and I've never done it that way, or what about, kind of fill in the blank, or have you thought about fill in the blank, right? So we'll see that dip because of our egocentric nature. The third reason we see that dip has a lot to do with our habits. And we have to learn learn something new. We have to unlearn the old and learn new. And it's about creating muscle memory. And sometimes that comes, with frustration, depending on how long you've been doing something a certain way. I think it's also important to remember that change management is a structured process that can help us tackle that dip. It can help us to mitigate. It can help us to minimize. It can help us to shorten the timeline to achieving our return on investment, but we can't eliminate it. It's not, people are people and people have emotional reactions. And as long as people have emotional reactions, we're going to see a dip. It just is the reality. And I think that the important thing to remember is, if you go to the next slide, that the closer you are to the decision, the quicker you move up that change cycle. And so for our leaders, I talk about it in terms of kind of like the four A's, right? Either it starts with awareness, we have our aha moment, we start to accept it, and then we start to adopt it. And leaders who maybe are wrestling with a decision for 6 or 12 or 20 months before, you actually implement or start a project, right? They've had a lot of time to work through all of those critical factors and to think about it. And about the time that they are starting to have their aha or their acceptance is about the time other people are starting to get ramped up. And about the time the project team is starting to kind of like accept and go, oh, I get it, is about the time that the next group, our managers, our supervisors, our change agents, are starting to learn about it. And they're learning just about the time, all of our employees who are impacted are starting to think about it. So the key takeaway for you is to remember just about the time that you are accepting and having your aha and moving your way through is just about the time that other people are starting to learn about the project. If you can click next. Right? So you can start to feel like a broken record, or because you've accepted it, it can start to feel individually as a change leader, as a leader, or as a project team member, we've said this 45 times, or we've been talking about this for 6 months. Why aren't people getting it? And that is just a natural reaction on projects, but it's also something to be aware of as a change leader, that, you know, as you are embracing and accepting is about the time the next group is starting to learn about the project. And I think that's really where change leadership comes in. Next slide. We have to, it's really around thinking about how do we help move people through that change cycle. And in my opinion, having done this for, you know, a number of years, there's a lot of effort and time that is spent kind of looking at things above the surface. What do we think gets things done, right? Strategies, mission, vision, goals, right? Every one of us have probably been on a project where we were outlining the strategic plan, or we were talking about mission, vision, and goals, or we were talking about, you know, wild, you know, crazy objectives. But in my opinion, a lot of time is spent above the surface, but we don't spend as much time below the surface, which is where work really gets done. And I'm sure as you kind of look at this iceberg, you can kind of think about some of these things that really get things moving, right? It's really around the experiences that we create for people. That's what drives mindsets and belief structures. And our belief structures, the things that are playing out in our head, is what really motivates our behavior, right? And so much of our experience and our emotional reaction and how we've experienced change in the past, or how we've experienced leaders as they've led through change, are they reputable? Do they have a history of you know, talking a good talk, but when push comes to shove, you know, they're not very good role models? Have we seen indications that maybe they're not transparent or not above board, right? All of those things contribute to what's below the surface that really drives organizational behavior. It drives attitudes. It's the unwritten ways that work gets done. And as leaders, whatever your role is on a change initiative, we have to really be thinking about, these are the key things that are going to help us to move forward. And as in championship teams, all of those things that are working below the surface is what really drives us together as a team. And championship teams have learned how to address the good and the bad, right? How to overcome obstacles, how to push through difficulties, how to work together. I always think that, you know, back when I was moving from being an individual contributor on projects and, you know, kind of like a high performer, A+ performer, you know, everything was always great. Those first projects where I had to help coach other people through projects, and to that my ultimate kind of assessment of my success was dependent on other people and how they were doing, was very hard, because it meant it was no longer really about me. It was about the we. It wasn't about Shannon just being the shining star, but was about, how do I help to bring the team along? And you know, sometimes their skills weren't there, or sometimes they were having personal situations, or sometimes their attitudes kind of stunk. And as a team, we had to figure out how to work through those things. And so it's the same as I think about these pictures that you've just seen, all these teams of people who have achieved amazing things. They've had to work together and practice together and really work through difficult things in order to, when they were in the limelight and in those performance scenarios, that they really came together and understood their roles, and they each played their role, you know, brilliantly, right? And so for change management, I think it's very similar. If you go to the next slide, actually, can you just go to the next slide? Every every person has a role in change management. And as I think about like a football team, the the front line, the quarterback is the one who always gets the glory. But if you didn't have the front line out blocking and tackling, then you might not be able to make the play. And so really in change management, our front line are the executive sponsors and our leader coalitions and our subject matter experts in our project team. They're the ones who are really the face of the initiative that's in front of us. They're the ones who are talking about the impact, and they're understanding how people are reacting, and they're role modeling the acceptance and the adoption and the expectations. But behind the scenes, there are a lot of moving parts. There are a lot of integrated, integral activities that are going on that, one impacts another. And, our change management experts, you have your change management lead and your communications experts and training experts and business analysis and graphic design and business process owners and, fill in the blank. A lot of things going on behind the scenes that are really helping those forward-facing champions, right, to really lead the change effort. And I think it's important that we understand, if we are out on the front line, we understand what our role is. And if we are not on the front line, we need to understand what our role is. I know there are a number of you that I've worked with here. I just saw some of the names that are on the call today. I've worked with some of you on projects, right? And one of the things I constantly will say is no one wants to hear from me. I'm a consultant. I'm an advisor. I'm a change management person. Unless it is my direct team, nobody really wants to hear from me. They want to hear from the business leaders. They want to hear from their frontline manager. They want to hear from the business leaders. Why are we even doing this? What's the benefit to the organization? And they want to hear from their frontline managers, from the leader coalition, as to how it's going to impact me and how this is really going to help our organization and how we're going to get through it. They want some reassurance. And they want to hear from our project team and the SMEs. They want to hear from the subject matter experts on the validation of the way forward and how it's going to be successful, right? So everybody has a role to play on a project, but there are often a lot of mistakes that are made. And I just want to take a second, and if you pull out your smart device, and I just want you to think about projects you've been on. And this is a drop a pin. It's basically, you can drop as many pins as you think apply as you read through these. What are some of those mistakes that you've seen made on projects that you just know we should avoid that in the future, right? And these are mistakes that I have personally seen made on other projects, none of yours, definitely not any of yours, but on projects in my 20 years, right? Some of the big ones that I'm seeing you guys are identifying is that we understood how this was going to impact people. A positive of that is maybe we overestimate our people's, ability, which is, I guess, really good. We have a strong belief in our people, but sometimes we have to, recognize that there are limitations, or we have to, be cognizant of the fact that these are going to be bigger impacts. And I think that we are all a little bit more sensitive to it after living a 2020. I think not really seeking to understand the change, right? Like we didn't somehow, I've seen managers and leaders that were just like, okay, it's happening, but they didn't make the time to really understand what that meant so that they could explain it or provide input or identify potential pitfalls, be able to explain it to their people. Right. Sometimes the change is so substantial, we can get caught up in our own reaction, especially if it's extremely personal. If you find out that you're now being realigned to a new manager or a new boss, and you're not overly excited about it, our emotional reaction to that can kind of become the noise, and we may not be able to do what we need to be doing because our own reaction is kind of getting in the way. I've seen managers and leaders, I see the one down at the bottom, kind of creating an us versus them mentality, or blaming, right? Blaming somebody else for the change. And that can work in the short run because it draws people to you. as an individual, but in the long run, it actually does more damage to the team, and it does more damage to the organization if we're looking for scenarios where it's us versus them, or we're blaming somebody else because we don't agree with the change. And all of these mistakes, right, are things that we can anticipate on projects. And one of the best ways that you can address those is to be really deliberate in how you approach change management and structure on your project. If you can go to the next slide, Vanessa. Right. So really, change management is about being deliberate. It's about applying a structured framework. Our perspective at AVAP, we bring in a lot of goodness from ProSci and Cotter and Connor and LaMarche and, other ACMP, the ACMP standard, the Change Management Institute. But the bottom line is, it's not a one and done. It's not just an email, right? It's a framework. It's being structured. It's being deliberate to really drive and help people to be ready, willing, and able to make the transition, not just so that you can check the box the project is done, but so that you can actually drive long-term adoption, and that you can achieve what those business, you're making a financial investment in this initiative. And so we want to drive toward achieving that initiative. And it's comprehensive. If you go to the next slide. It's really comprehensive. And, I like to think of it in three buckets, right? Because this is where change leaders really play a key role. It's around helping the organization to be ready. And you do that by informing and engaging and communicating with and sharing information and letting individuals ask questions. This is all around your communications. It's about helping the organization to be willing. And if I were to say the number one area that organizations forget about, it's this piece. And this is really where change leadership has such a big role. Willing is about motivating. Motivating isn't about putting it on a piece of paper. Motivating isn't about posters on a wall. Motivating is often through one-on-one interactions. It's often through small group interactions. It's through feeling a connection with somebody in the organization. It's about trust and transparency and believing in the culture and just really having some type of connection with individuals within the organization. And that's really where our change leadership plays such a big role. And the third area is really around helping people to be able, right? It's around equipping them, which really translates to training. But our change leaders really will play a role in all three areas: communicating the value, engaging individuals, and sometimes coaching, right? Which is a key component of training. OCM is not just touchy-feely kumbaya or a therapy session. It's not just about sending one email or writing a job aid, and it's not optional if you want your project to be successful. It's really about thinking about the people side of change while you're thinking about your solution design. Go to the next slide. So I want you just to, let us know, as you think about your role on the projects that you're kind of embarking on right now, what role are you playing during times of change? Are you the project sponsor? Are you maybe a senior leader or a manager or supervisor or somebody who's in the transformation space? Are you an influencer or an opinion leader? Somebody who maybe is a subject matter expert, or you're playing, or you play one on TV, or you're a project team member, right? What is your role when you think about times of change? What role do you often take? You can think about something recently. You can think about something that's maybe coming up in the coming weeks. So a large majority of you are the change management practitioners and who are really the architects of the strategy, who are going to be in a situation where maybe you are coaching the sponsor, or you're coaching the transformation leaders of the coalition, or you're coaching the project team. Some of you are opinion leaders, and I I cannot emphasize how important you are. We are a Yelp nation. And sometimes, and I was reading an article the other day about how employee engagement is down and our trust of senior leaders is down. And so if a senior leader says we're going to do X, we don't always trust it. But if my peer or somebody I trust or somebody who's close to the decision, somebody I value says the same exact thing, then I'm more willing to give it a shot. I'm more willing to allow or give it a chance before I guess, judge, jury, and execution that something's not going to be successful. So your role as an opinion leader is super, super important. So let's just kind of spend just a couple seconds here on what you can do depending on what your role is on a project. As I mentioned, everybody has a role in managing and driving the change, right? And so something we don't have any sponsors. Nobody on our call identifies as a project sponsor, but I think it's important for you to just kind of know what are those sponsors in that sponsor coalition? What are they responsible for, right? They're the ones making the decisions and they're influencing the focus. So key things for them really during times of change as a change leader, and think of change leadership as a very transactional through the lens of a specific project. They need to be active and visible because the employees need to see them front and center. They need to create that coalition and be working across the enterprise to get their peers and their colleagues on board and serious about this project. They need to be communicating value and not just the benefits to the company. They talk about individual value and not just project status updates, right? Like we're on scope, schedule, budget, but really what's the value to the organization and to the value to the individual. Second group is really around managers and supervisors, right? Those business leaders that are maybe a little bit more frontline, front and center to the employees. So if you have employees reporting to you, you probably fall into this category whether you realize it or not. So if you have anybody, even one person, or if you're a mentor, so maybe informally, managers and supervisors are the front line and they help translate the project benefits and they help mitigate and manage resistance and negative reactions. We give our people productive ways to work through their change cycle. So they're there to champion the change and they're in a fishbowl. If you're a manager or supervisor, you're in a fishbowl because your team's looking to you on whether they should accept this change, whether they should resist it. They're looking to you to help communicate personal impacts. What's it really mean to me? So your team really is going to trust your assessment, maybe over folks that they don't work with on a regular basis. And then you're there to help them coach through the transition. What that means is sometimes you have to sit with uncomfortable emotion, and sometimes it's just listening and validating people's thoughts, but it's also offering them productive ways to kind of, sometimes change just happens to us and we don't really have the opportunity to inform or influence it. And we've got to figure out how to be supportive and to get ourselves on board. Third key role is really the project team. And I would say that all of our change managers, if you are a change practitioner, if you are a change leader, you are falling in this bucket, and then you're going to fall in the next bucket as well. So you're focused on designing the new way of working, and you're becoming the change agents of the project. You're thinking with a people mindset first. And our change managers, right? Our job is to really even to help our project team members to really understand what does that mean. Sometimes we have to challenge the technical and the functional only decisions. I know I've worked on projects where, I was the uncomfortable one to say, we should not be going live, with this new solution in X, Y, and Z month because, fill in the blank. Let's look at all these things that are bubbling up and piling up on our people. And then you're going to be the reason that people say they couldn't get certain things done, right? And as a project team member, and specifically as a change management expert, don't underestimate your insight and your influence. You know what's going on across the organization. You know the domain and the functional expertise. And if you're a change management person, you understand people. right? So our project team is super important. And then the last bucket really is around those opinion leaders, those key influencers, those change agents. And our change management team can be change agents, but they're also individuals who maybe they have no supervisory authority. Maybe they're just the person who always just seems to be in the know. Maybe they're the person with the most up-to-date information about how things get done in a specific department. And so we need to make sure that we're pulling them into the project. And if you fall into this category, right, key influencer, or just a change agent, a peer change agent that's detailed to a project, make sure you're asking a lot of questions, and ask those questions that you think that your peers are going to ask and want to know about. Make sure you're sharing your observations and your perspective on how past changes have been managed and what you think those impacts might be. If you're not kind of serving in that liaison capacity, then sometimes there's a gap in the project team. And so you kind of have to lead from where you are. And I think really remember that you have more influence than maybe you even realize. I sometimes hear myself quoted, and it reminds me, I just think I'm Shannon from Ohio, and sometimes I'll hear myself quoted and I'm like, maybe I have more influence than I realize. So bring your passion and your advocacy, both for the project, but also for the people who are going to be impacted. So everyone really has a role in managing and driving the change. Our change management team, you guys are also as experts, you also serve as a PM kind of behind the scenes. You're making sure all the deliverables and the activities and everything's orchestrated. You're making sure the messages and that people are equipped. You're making sure that these groups of people at least have the information available to them. But if you fall into one of these other buckets, then you have to like translate that as a change leader. You have to own it, translate it, digest it, and be present for the people that you're interacting with. So my encouragement to you as you think about your next project is really just to take a second to reflect, right? And to spend time, if you can move forward, Vanessa, to move forward and just to, take a second to reflect on a couple key things. The first is really, how have you contributed to managing change on, projects that are going on in front of you over the last couple of weeks? Sometimes you're not on a project. Sometimes it's, HR is rolling out something new, or as gosh, this is a project all of us are probably experiencing right now, as we think about, return to work scenarios, right? You may not be a designer, you may not be the change management lead, but we're all kind of impacted. And how do you contribute to that? Are you speaking positively about the project? Are you seeking ways to understand? Are you understanding what your role is and how you can help things to be successful and move forward productively? The second thing to really kind of reflect on is, what can you do better? What can you do more of? What can you do differently? And more importantly, how are you going to hold yourself accountable? I saw Becky on the line. I know we spent a lot of time with their leaders to understand their sponsorship responsibilities and their manager responsibilities. And, the key call to action was always pausing to get them to reflect on how they were going to hold themselves accountable. Because I know if I jot down a goal for myself, even if it's on a sticky note, right? Like there's an accountability factor because I want to at least check that off my sticky note. So how are you going to, kind of keep yourself in check and remind yourself of your responsibility? And the third thing to really think about is, what do you need? What do you need in order to help support the change? Do you need more information? Do you need to have a conversation with somebody? If you're serving in one of these roles as kind of a change leader, sometimes we have to work through our own reactions so that we can be productive and supportive of a change. I worked on a project years ago that I just didn't think it was the right way forward. And so my senior leader and we had very candid conversations where, behind closed doors would have, I would just be very candid about my thoughts when we were out in public, I was also very supportive, but I was seeking to understand. And then I was the advocate to bring back not just concerns, but solutions. Anybody can complain, anybody can kvetch about a situation, but to offer solutions and ideas, that I think separates us from having change happen to us and being part of the process and really kind of leading from wherever you are. So with that, I hope that you have gleaned a nugget today in the short time that we've had together. I would like to ask or invite you to join us next week, where we'll have a conversation with Chad Luxembourg, the CEO of SciTrain. It's a strategic partner of AVAP. SciTrain is a global leader in leadership development. They bring some really innovative, objective, non-threatening approaches to help develop leadership skills in organizations. They've worked with Fortune 500 companies. They have offices all over the world, so they're have a lot of cultural sensitivity. And as Chad and I have been spending time together over the last year, just talking about what they're seeing in the marketplace, I think having just a candid conversation with him about the state of leadership development and what he's seeing during times of change and disruption, and what lessons he's gleaning, what lessons the leaders are learning, that he can bring that forward and share that with all of us. And then on the 21st, Chad and I are going to present just on transformational leadership and learning agility. SciTrain has done some really groundbreaking kind of work in the space of learning agility with some proprietary tools and questionnaires that are science-backed, and really leveraging that as they're developing their leadership development programs. And I think as we have been, as AVAB has been working with our clients, we've been spending a lot of time talking about organizational resilience, and a key component of that is transformational leadership. And there's a really brilliant overlap there. So join us as we kind of talk about those two things, and hopefully there will be things that you can bring into your initiatives as well. And if you do have questions or want to talk about a project or just want to brainstorm, I know a lot of times I get questions after these webinars of very practical, pragmatic, specific, hey, I'm having a X, Y, and Z challenge. If you are looking for ways to develop change leadership for a specific project, I'm happy to jump on a call with you for 15, 20 minutes. Please feel free to reach out. I think Abby just dropped my LinkedIn information. You can connect on LinkedIn or send me an email. And I think they also dropped a registration link for the remaining 2 sessions in the chat as well. So I'm just going to pause there and just see if anybody has any questions for me. And Vanessa, so I'll turn the floor over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Shannon. That was a great session. Yeah, like Shannon said, Abby dropped in the link to register for the final 2 sessions in the chat, along with Shannon's LinkedIn if you want to connect with her. So we did have a few questions come in during the presentation, but still want to encourage everyone to send any questions you have in through the Q&A box or the chat function. And we'll get started with these questions. So Shannon, what tactic have you seen to be the most successful in mitigating employee resistance to change?
I think the biggest, gosh, let me use an example. Years ago, I worked for a large consulting firm, and we were going through a large operating model transition, and it had pretty significant impact on our senior leadership. We had a reduction in force, pretty significant reduction in force. And the best example that I saw as you mitigate something that is so emotionally charged, will I have a job tomorrow? Which automatically drops us to safety and security, was how leaders rally people and give them an opportunity to candidly talk about their concerns. I think that is probably the number one thing that that leaders can do to help manage and mitigate resistance is really just to open up the conversation and invite the conversation and to set the tone for transparency. I know a lot of organizations and leaders say that they have open door policies. And this is a pet peeve of mine when people say, you know, when you've had a situation where that's been challenging, when people say, let me know if there's anything I can do. People in times of distress typically don't reach out. So the number one thing that leaders can do to help mitigate resistance is to be the ones reaching out and creating the opportunities to allow employees to talk, or to allow you know, whether it's individually or through groups. So I think that's the number one thing that you can do to help mitigate resistance. The second thing, ProSci says that the number one reason people resist change is because they weren't aware of it. So I think the second thing you can do, you didn't ask me for the second, I'm going to give it to you anyway, it's a freebie, is make sure you have a communications plan that starts well in advance of whenever you're going to launch the project. If you're communicating 2 weeks before something new is rolling out, you're about 8 weeks late. And the third thing, you didn't ask me for this, but the third thing is pay special attention to your middle managers. They are at the bottom of the pressure. They're in a vice. They're getting things pushed down from their people, and they're getting things pushed down, expectations pushed down from their leaders. If you do nothing else, engage them and help them work through it, because they will help their people to work through it. So you asked for one, you got three. It was a bonus day.
Thanks so much, Shannon. The next question asks, how does change leadership differ in a remote world?
You know, I think it's a little harder. Is that an understatement? It's like unprecedented. It's a little harder in a remote world, because you don't get the hallway. You don't run into somebody. You don't necessarily see their facial expression. You know, so you're relying on nonverbals to know, hey, somebody has puffy red eyes, and so maybe I should ask a question like, are you okay? So because I know I don't have my video camera on today, but you know, sometimes we use video cameras in our organizations, but sometimes people feel more, they feel like they have to be on, right? And so it's harder even to get folks when they're on camera to be transparent. So a couple of things that I think that you can do as a leader in a remote environment: create hallway conversations, whether that's through IM or through text messages, or creating text trails or text groups. Yes, picking up the phone and calling somebody. I know we've been using Teams more and more at AVAP, and Team or Yammer or Chatter if you're on Salesforce, but you have to create those hallway conversations. And the questions you ask it's not just about, hey, what's the status on X, Y, and Z. It's also about how you doing, humanizing our interactions. I know there was a point in the November timeframe, just before Thanksgiving, and then following through into January, where I could really sense that folks were just burdened. And so I made a deliberate effort in all of my meetings that instead of, I'm a very business, get to the point, but I had to make a very conscious decision that in all of my meetings, I was starting them with chit chat. It kills me. I'm an introvert. Chit chat is not my favorite. But I knew it was important because not everybody is wired like me. And I think as leaders, kind of driving change, we have to humanize and make that a priority. I also think sometimes it's okay to have a conversation without your camera. And sometimes people, it's almost like when you're driving in a car and you're sitting side by side, you don't have to make eye contact. Sometimes that's where the most transparent conversations happen. And so kind of creating those safe spaces for folks, I think are important in a remote environment. Not everything has to be about work. So leaders set the tone for that.
Thanks, Shannon. Looks like one more question came in. This
Yeah.
person says, when you have serious concerns with the project's direction and you know there is a proven better way and leadership still wants to go the other way, how do you stay positive?
Well, I'm not always successful in full transparency. I'm not always successful. I think there are a couple of things that you can do. We all have our personal trusted advisors. And I have kind of like a pinky swear girlfriend's agreement that will have a cone of silence where I can just say whatever I'm thinking without concern of being judged or that it's going to kind of get out to other folks, right? Because my frustration sometimes is really palpable, and if I can't work through that productively, then it is hard to continue to do what I need to do. In tandem with that, I also think that it's really important that we have a boundary. There are things that are within the realm of our control, and there are things that are outside of the realm of our control. And sometimes when we see there are better ways of doing it, but it's outside of the realm of our control, as difficult as it is, we sometimes just have to acknowledge and accept, right? It's not there's literally nothing I can do about it. And if we continue to allow that emotion to eat at us, then it just starts, it's like a toxic poison. It just starts to permeate through everything. So it's like we do have to put it in a box, right? And we have to give ourselves permission to like even put that box in a closet, in the back of the closet where we're not looking at it. And if somebody asks for our input, we need to be prepared with solutions. We need to be prepared with ideas on how to move forward. I also think that if there, if there are better ways of doing it, and you have a relationship with somebody who's an influencer, have a candid conversation. And if leadership continues to drive forward in a specific way, I guess that's one of the benefits of being a consultant. There are a lot of times I'm working with clients and I adamantly disagree with the way forward. I'm an advisor. I say my piece, but ultimately then my job is to execute and to help us to be as successful as possible and to avoid some of the challenges and to be prepared when the opportunity presents itself, because it will. If you missed it the first time around, those challenges present themselves a second and third time, to be prepared to offer those solutions. But with regard to positivity, get yourself a squad with a cone of silence, get it off your chest, put it in a box, and do something positive for yourself, like take lunch or something. I sometimes take a break, and we'll take just a head break, even if that's just a walk down the street. So that was a lot of words. Hopefully something in there was helpful. Well, you're welcome, Tom.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Shannon. Well, if anyone, is thinking and has any other questions, feel free to reach out to Shannon once again via email or LinkedIn. Thank you so much for joining today's webinar. Once again, we will be sending out the recording and a link to register for the final 2 sessions. Also want to mention that once we disconnect today, a short survey will pop up on your screen. We would love if you completed it to let us know if you found today's session helpful and what you would like to see more of in the future. So thank you again, and we hope to see you the next 2 Wednesdays at the same time for the rest of our series. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us. Have a good one.